Well, good evening. Welcome. We're so pleased to see such a great turnout for our event tonight. I'm Zoe Miller, and I'm the coordinator for the Friends of Allen's Corner. We'll tell you a little bit more about us later, but we care about this place, and so one of the things that we wanted to know more about is how it got to be the way it is. There are a few things we'd like to change about the roads here.
No.
But we really love so many things about this place. And so we wanted to look at, how did it develop to be the way it is today? And what clues might that provide for the things that we want to see change about it? And so what better person and what better organization to help us do that than Greater Portland Landmarks? And so we actually, when we started off on this, so Gretchen Greenberg here in the light blue, and I got really nerdy looking at all sorts of old pictures, and Gretchen actually reached out to Greater Portland Landmarks, and at the time, Julie was not available. So we sort of went on, and Gretchen did a ton of research. And then Julie became available, and so it was like a very nice serendipity. We're fans, and I'm sure some of you are also fans of other presentations that she's done. She shared with me that she's been involved with Greater Portland Landmarks since 1994, so she knows a few things about this area and the trends and looking at this building, she immediately knew that it had been an inn, and Gretchen and I were like, oh, okay, that makes so much sense, right? And so one of the things that I really appreciated as I got to know Julia through this process is how much just love she brings to the work, and that she cares about preserving the places that we like, not losing those links to the past, and has just a very kind of like even-keeled way of talking and thinking about it. And she's really brought that to the presentation tonight. So we'll have Julie's presentation and a lot of images. And then we'll have time for folks to share stories. We imagine that some of you have your own experiences having spent time in the neighborhood, maybe even growing up in the neighborhood. I have a few stories that folks told me that I can share that are pretty cool. And then we have some refreshments downstairs. And really, part of our goal of tonight as the Friends of Allen's Corner is building community. And that's really at the core of what we're looking to do together. Really believing that, if we can get to know each other as neighbors and become friends, then all the good things will flow from that. So we hope you meet somebody new tonight. Sorry it's a little hot. I think hopefully we'll get through it. But I'd love to turn it over to Julie to come on up and share her presentation.
Good evening. So we'll start and go in a mostly chronological order. I've got a lot to say about some of the slides. Some of the other slides we'll kind of move through fairly quickly. I think pictures are worth more than words, so I like to have more pictures than words. So where are we? We're here in Allen's Corner. And throughout the presentation tonight, I'll share some different maps and aerial images. And where possible, I've tried to key in the three major roads. In blue, we have Allen's Avenue, which was the Stevens Plain Road, also the Falls Road as it headed off into Falmouth. That's the blue line. The yellow line is Washington Avenue. It went by some other names, which I'll talk a bit about in a little bit. And in red is Ray Street, which is actually a fairly early street. And then in the dashed line, you can see Auburn Street heading off to the north towards Gray. Since European settlement in this area, Allen's Corner has been part of Falmouth between 1718 and 1814. Then in 1814, Westbrook separated from Falmouth. Falmouth is that whole area you see the black outline of. It encompassed Falmouth, Westbrook, what we know as Deering, the Portland Peninsula, South Portland, and Cape Elizabeth. And then this area became part of the town of Deering in 1871 through 1899, when it was annexed by Portland. So here's a fairly early map. This is 1781. You can see those three lines, the yellow line, which is Washington Avenue, the red line, which is Ray Street, and the blue line, which connects County Road or Outer Congress Street all the way through to the Presumpscot River. It was known as Stevens Plain Road. You can see that if you follow the red line down through the yellow line, there's another road, that's Ocean Avenue. Ocean Avenue is one of the earliest streets off Peninsula as well. So originally, Washington Avenue didn't connect up here at the corner like it does now. The original route was across Ray Street because Fall Brook and the wet area around Fall Brook prevented them from building a road initially up to this area. Here's a topographical map, which you can sort of see here. We have the Presumpscot River kind of going off the top of the slide. And you can see the yellow line, which is Washington Avenue, runs along most of the ridge. Certainly the Main Central Railroad, which came later, follows much of that high point of this area. One of the reasons that this area was settled was its proximity to the Presumpscot River, and as well as the water supply at Fall Brook. The word Presumpscot is believed to come from the native Abenaki and Pennacook word for rough waters, rough ledges, or place of many falls. In the 1600s, the Wabanaki people had a pretty fluid membership and fluid locations caused by natural disasters and diseases, warfare, the push of English colonials, and the pull of the French, who wanted them in new missionary villages in southern Quebec. Tactically regrouping and relocating was how these people's strategy for survival. The Abenaki and Pennacook refers to an overlapped area where the Pennacook Wabanakis, forced out of their former Merrimack River villages by the ever-expanding English settlers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, met and combined with the southernmost villages of the Abenaki people that lived along the Presumpscot and the Sebago Lake watershed. And it was along the falls of the Presumpscot and at the confluence with its tributaries that the Presumpscot Wabanakis were flourishing. They ate from its abundant fishery and grew corn along its banks, and for countless generations the river was their home and their sustenance as it was for their ancestors before them. So in this slide you can see the Presumpscot highlighted in blue, stretching from the coast inland to Gorham and Windham. And a little bit further out, a little bit higher, looking back, is this map, which shows that the Presumpscot is part of a blue highway that connected the Sebago Lake region to the sea. So from the lakes to Casco Bay, different seasons would find the native peoples migrating to the most appropriate places along the river and the waterways for hunting, agriculture, and fishing, and thriving upon the abundant natural resources of the watershed. The first Europeans erected a dam at the Presumpscot Falls in 1732, and with it came the blockage of seasonal migration of fish. The Abenaki Pennacook people's lifeways had depended upon the fish passage upstream, and the loss of the fish passage was one of the many complaints of their people in the Anglo-Wabanaki Wars between 1765 and 1763. And unlike the four tribes that are recognized in Maine, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, the Maliseet, and the Micmacs, the Pennacook and the Abenaki from the Presumpscot region were never recognized tribes because where they were here in southern Maine, they were pushed out so early by the colonists and migrated to Quebec and were incorporated into some of the French Quebec tribes. The roads that form Allen's Corner intersection have been known by many names, as I mentioned a few of them earlier. The corner is the intersection of two historic roads, and in blue is the road from Stevens Plain, which is our Deering Center, that extends to Falmouth, and it was known in part as the Falls Road, and part Stevens Plain Road, and then later all of it became Allen Avenue. In yellow is the road from Ocean Avenue to Falmouth, near Washington Avenue, but it's now Washington Avenue rather, and it was originally also known as the Meadow Road. And you can see the dashed line shows that it was extended from Ray Street north to the intersection around 1800. North of the Falls Road or Allen Avenue, Washington Avenue was known as Quaker Lane because there was a Quaker settlement on the Presumpscot in the Blackstrap area. So why is it called Allen's Corner? Well, it's been known as other things too. It's been called Abbott's Corner, it's been called Shaw's Corner, and Allen's Corner. But Allen's Corner is the name that has primarily stuck. And that's due to the fact that it was for many years the home of Dr. Solomon Allen. He purchased this house, which was at the corner, I would say it's where the pot store is. It was a mobile station for many years. I'll go with that. So he purchased this house, and he was originally from Gray and moved down to Portland, married a Portland woman. He married Mrs. Mary Levitt of Portland in 1825, and Mary and Solomon had 4 daughters together. Now, Mary had been married before. As I said, she was Mrs. Levitt. Her maiden name was Barber, and that will come into play in just a few minutes. Mary had 2 sons. She got married in May to her first husband, and by August, he was deceased in Cuba. Their first son became a sailor and died at age 15, also at sea. Her second son, which curiously was born 2 years after her husband died, but also carried the name Levitt, he was, let me make sure I get his first, yeah, he was William Levitt, and he was the founder of Chase Levitt, which is a marine supplier in Portland, long-time Portland company. So Dr. Solomon Allen and his wife lived here, raised their family and her 2 children, and he was an officer in a club called the East Westbrook Temperance Watchmen. As you can probably tell from the name, this was an organization that promoted the temperance movement and legislation that created Maine's first prohibition. That was called the Maine Law, and it was enacted in 1851. That law was repealed in 1856, but eventually prohibition was written into Maine's constitution in the mid-1880s, and that wasn't repealed until national prohibition was repealed in the 20s. And being a physician, I can imagine why he probably was concerned about over-imbibing in alcohol and became a member of the temperance movement. Although we searched, we couldn't find any research that connected him to the Quakers, other than perhaps he may have certainly known them as his neighbors. But the Quakers were also very involved in the temperance movement, so it's likely that was a very strong movement in this neighborhood. So this was the house. It served as an inn and a tavern. Of course, it was on a great route coming down from Gray. There would have been lots of stage traffic. It also had 60 acres and was quite a large farm, and it remained undivided largely right up until the 1940s, which is why Shaw's and the Plaza went there, because there was empty land for it to go there. It was later owned by the Smith family, and John A. Smith was the owner, and his wife Ellen. And they also had a family and lived in the house and used it as their farm. And from the census records, we know that they kept a number of animals. In 1880, it was recorded they had 26 cows, 60 pigs, and 120 chickens, which likely would have been in that small off-white little chicken coop right there. And they also had half an acre of an apple orchard that produced 20 bushels of apples each year. And we understand that there were some apple trees still surviving when some people moved into one of the subdivisions to the back of it. By the time the Smiths sold the farm, it included 2 other houses. It included this 2-family house at 35 to 37 Auburn Street and some outbuildings, as well as a smaller single-family house at 400 Allen Avenue. And I mentioned that Mary Solomon, her maiden name was Barber. Well, the Barbers lived just down the street in a house at 246 Allen Avenue called the Barber Homestead. It supposedly was built about 1770. It could be older. I know that Hugh actually owned the land as early as 1757, but the traditional date is 1770 for this house. It was later owned by the Knight family and members of the Cobb family, and there it is today. And its early history is actually recorded in its deeds, and so that area that's highlighted in yellow talks about when it was built and who built it. Another early map of the area is this map from 1828. It shows just the major streets, and then somebody has done a little drawing of a historic house, wherever there was a historic house, a little bit like Monopoly houses. The red line is the Stevens Plain Road, and I've also shown on here, let's see if I get this go. Here we go. So this is Summit Street, this is Allen Avenue, and this is Washington. So you can see there's the tavern, the Allen's Tavern right there. And then across the street is another historic house, or building. And that would have been Pride Hall. Pride Hall was built about 1828 when that map was first made, and was demolished in 1957. It's had a number of owners, but probably the one that most people still have some reference to is the Abbotts, who ran a store there for many, many years, starting in 1857. And it was kind of known as Abbott's Store, which also occasionally led to the name of Abbott's Corner being used for Allen's Corner. Upstairs was a hall that could be used by the Masons and any fraternal organizations like that, or community organizations. And then downstairs was a store, a neighborhood store. Here's a postcard image where you can see, beyond the kids and everything playing, there is Pride Hall, and beyond it across the intersection is the Solomon Allen House. Moving forward a little bit in time to 1857, you can see that it's still largely rural. This is one of the first maps that includes the names of who lived or who owned the houses. And you can see there's about 7 or 8 buildings around the corner, including a blacksmith shop and a one-room schoolhouse, a graveyard, and the corner store. Across the street from Pride Hall, a second store was built at 341 Allen Avenue, right at the corner with Washington. It was a grocery store for many years, and it was connected to a stable out the back, which is what you can see in the lower slide, and that faced onto Washington Avenue. These buildings were all gone by the 1930s, and they were replaced by a gas station. They were owned by members of the Noyes family. They owned it from about 1891 to 1902. There were 2 brothers that owned the store, and Edward, I don't know how much Edward worked at the store, because in his census records he indicates that he worked for the railroad, and then from where he retired, and he lived at 1367 Washington Avenue, so right here in the neighborhood. It was later a store owned by another Abbott, member of the Abbott family, and a gentleman named Charles McIntosh. Along Allen Avenue, just next to the corner store, they added a bakery building and then a barber shop in that one-story addition between the 2 larger buildings. In 1871, Deering separated from Westbrook. Deering was developing as a residential area that was much more closely associated with Portland than it was with downtown Westbrook. And this is an image from an advertisement which shows the Oddfellow building at Woodford's Corner, which briefly served as Deering City Hall. In 1871, the corner is a little bit more developed, but not too much. A few more buildings, just a couple more. Still just a couple corner stores, still a blacksmith shop, still a schoolhouse at the corner, and a few residential dwellings. Part of the impetus to break off from Westbrook was that the Deering neighborhoods really were more closely associated with downtown Portland than Westbrook, as I said. Most people who lived in Deering didn't necessarily work at Cumberland Mills, in any of the mills, or downtown Westbrook. A lot of them worked in Portland or on the waterfront in Portland. In addition, residential development in Deering was driven by new transportation opportunities, making travel into Portland easier. Portland's streetcar system was expanded, connecting downtown to the neighborhoods along Deering's major travel corridors, beginning in 1864. A horse-car line connected Portland's peninsula to Woodford's Corner, out Pleasant Avenue to Deering Center, and then along Stevens Avenue to Morrill's Corner. So someone living in Allen's Corner could walk down Allen Avenue to Morrill's and hop on a tram or streetcar and go into the city, or they could walk down to Ocean Avenue and get onto the streetcar system. This is a reconstructed map. Yeah, it's clear, okay. This is a reconstructed map of the streetcar system, which depicts the earliest lines in purple, kind of a purplish blue. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. It could be my aim. There we go. So you can see like this purple, this is one of the first off-peninsula lines, went out to Woodford's Corner, hung a left, went westward to Deering Center, and came up to Morrill's Corner. The newer electrified lines are shown in red on the map, and you can see that they greatly expanded the system in the 1890s when they switched from horse-drawn cars to electrified cars. And Allen's Corner was connected to the network in 1898 with the arrival of an electric streetcar system. Here are some images. The one on the upper left is looking north on Washington Avenue from the Edgewood Avenue before the road was improved. There's a series of photos from Public Works and Public Works Archive that document when they were going through and improving all the roads. They're a beautiful collection. And on the right-hand side, looking north at Allen's Avenue on Washington, near the intersection before the road work in the picture above, and below after a new macadam pavement had been installed. You can see the streetcar lines very clearly in the bottom image here, and you can see there's Pride Hall, and there is the store across the street in the old Staples building. This slide shows an image of the school, a new school that was built near the corner, actually next door to where we are right now. This was the Allen School. So Westbrook had built the initial school that was on Allen Avenue. And then when Deering separated from Westbrook, and as the neighborhood grew, particularly around the time when the streetcar was coming in and bringing more residents to the neighborhood, they needed a new school, and they built the school here on Washington Avenue next to the church. And that remained as the area school until 1957, when the Lysath Elementary School was built, and the city tore down this school building and sold it to the church for their parking lot. You can see the cute. All the kids in 1945, so if you or someone you know is from the area, maybe or 1945, maybe they're in the picture.
Do you know what year the school was built after it became Deering separated from Westbrook? You said when the streetcars got there.
Yeah, I don't have an exact date. I know that from looking at the building, it looks looks like it's 1890s. I know that it also expanded when Portland took over, so about I think it was expanded in 1903, 1904, around there. And I don't know how much rework they did that might explain why it looks the way it does in this picture. But I just know that it was definitely here by 1914 when it first appears on a map. But it's also, it's here earlier because it appears in the school records and the tax booklets.
Was it just a grade school, or what age was there?
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't see that in there. I would imagine probably 8th grade.
Yeah.
There were 4 classrooms, so I can imagine it might have been like first, second. They could have bunched them up together. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the houses in the neighborhood as well as some of the commercial buildings that I've shown you so far. This is out on, I would call it Outer Washington Avenue. Once you get past Libs, that's what I call it. I don't know what you all do. This is a house that was built in 1898, so that's the year that the streetcar first came to the area. And we start to see some houses typical of this size and era being constructed in the neighborhood. Charles Tibbetts was a carpenter. I believe he probably built this house for himself, and the Deering tax records show that he owned it, that he was a carpenter, and when they were taxing him, it was partially built. And as an architect, every carpenter I've ever worked with has a house that's partially built, so I would assume he was working on it when he could. You can see it was a fairly large house, and it has a great 2-car garage out at the back, very typical of an early garage. I'll just say that a lot of these photos that you'll see that have the address kind of scribbled across them in a marker, these are from the 1924 tax records that the city of Portland has, so this is a great collection of historic images of buildings that were paying taxes in 1924, and they're available online at the Maine Historical Society. There's the building today. Still has its little garage, just different doors out the back. One of the other things that occurred around this same time was subdivisions. I think we all know what subdivisions are, but they started fairly early. I would say that from other neighborhoods that I've studied, that Allen's Corner was a little bit late to the subdivision game. But they certainly did have some, and one of the first and earliest subdivisions is Maplewood Park, which is just behind here. You can see I called out the location of the schoolhouse that was drawn on this land plan. Maplewood Avenue is still Maplewood Avenue, but of course Summer Street is now, I'm not going to find it in my notes. What is
Abbott.
Yes, that Abbott Street. Thank you. And if you look on Maplewood Avenue in the middle, where Summer Street or Abbott Street connects to it, you can see there was an existing house. And here's that house. This is again a 1924 historic tax photo. This was the Joseph Wells house. So Maplewood Park was laid out by Joseph Wells and George Littlefield in 1898, and this was the house that Joseph Wells had built for his family that same year in 1898. Now, although we know from land records that he was acting as a land developer, he's listed in census records as a farmer, although I can't imagine he was farming too much on that small plot of land. But you can see he had a really lovely barn out in the back of the house. He and his wife lived here with their 2 daughters, and the daughters retained the house for many years until just before they died. They never married. And there's the house in a more recent image without the barn. So Deering wasn't an independent town for very long. And in 1899, Portland annexed the then city of Deering. It was initially a town, became a city. And the push to annex Deering began when the Maine legislature enacted enabling legislation in 1897. And although many Deering voters voted against annexation, Portland really wanted Deering for a number of reasons. And the legislature pushed the measure through, and Deering was annexed, adding 7,500 people to the city. It added thousands of acres of land to a community that was largely restricted from development because it couldn't grow further than the peninsula or the islands. And this additional land would become very critical for Portland's growth after World War II. And this is just a headline from, I think this is from the Portland Daily, announcing the merger of the two towns. Shortly after that is another historic, and one of the last historic maps, which is this one from 1914, which shows Allen's Corner. So we have Allen Avenue here, Washington Avenue, and Auburn Street right here. So this is the Maplewood Park subdivision that I talked about, that was 1898. You can see there's been some subdivision up here between the two major corridors, and as well as a subdivision down here. And that down here is the graveyard off, what's the name of it? Maplewood Grove.
Fobes, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Deering Grange. So the North Deering Grange was established in 1916, and the building was constructed around 1922, from what I can tell. The area was still pretty rural around Allen's Avenue, beyond the concentration of buildings at the corner. So it's not surprising that a grange would have been located here to serve the local farming families. It was built on land owned by Fred Lovejoy, who built the Lovejoy Field subdivision out behind the grange, on land that he had purchased from Louisa Reed, who lived in the house you can see just beyond the grange, which is still there, that house. Granges in Maine started in the 1870s, so this one's a bit later than others. But the Grange was a pretty progressive, especially when it came to women's issues. Women in the organization had an equal vote to men long before they could vote in politics, and the Grange supported prohibition. Here's a more recent picture from their Facebook of the Grange, largely unchanged. And you can see the Grange in the background of this image. In 1924, next door to the Grange was this cute little gas station, which is a pretty typical, simple form of a gas station, early gas stations. You can still see them sometimes when you're driving around on the roads in rural Maine. Just a very small office and a pump out front. Behind the Grange was another fairly early subdivision called the Homesteads. I guess that's kind of a play on words with homestead. This was developed by the City and Suburban Land Trust in 1911. It laid out Pennell Avenue and August Avenue, which is now, yes, thank you, MC Drive, is that right? And because this was laid out in about 1911, when you're driving through the neighborhood, you'll find there are some bungalow-style houses. There's some houses with gable roofs, which have like a double pitch on them, and then there's some four squares, that look like essentially like a little box with a hip roof on it. There's some of those in there, and those were some of the earliest homes in this subdivision. But largely, the rest of this neighborhood wasn't built out until the late 1940s and early 1950s, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go forward. Another early subdivision was the Pines, done by the A.H. Chapman Land Company. This was a subdivision that connected Washington Avenue and Ray Street, and the central spine that you can see on the image, that's Maine Avenue. It included Florida, Michigan, and Dakota Street in Idaho. I don't know if all those streets got built, but there certainly were very tiny little lots. Some of the housing that we see from this period, particularly on the major corridors, is a housing form that we see throughout Portland, triple decker. This has a much higher density, can fit a lot more people into a house lot. And this was a triple decker that was built by the Dresser family. In 1912, they bought this farmhouse next door at 1359 Washington Avenue. And, And then they proceeded to build the triple decker. They did live in the triple decker and rented out the other 2 units. Mr. Dresser, Albert Dresser, was a lumberman, and he had a lumber yard out in back of the house. So of course, eventually, we know that the streetcar systems gave way to the buses in the first half of the 20th century. And in this image, we can see a Portland Company bus headed south on Washington Avenue at Allen's Corner. And in the background, we can see Pride Hall, the brick building in the background there. And to the left of it is a one-story building occupied by the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company shop. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company operated many small neighborhood grocery stores in Portland and in other towns as well. It would later be known as the A&P. The company operated from 1859 to 2015, but from 1915 to 1975, it was the largest grocery retailer in the U.S. It mostly operated what they called economy stores that only sold dry goods, no meat, produce, or dairy. And just to the left of the bus, you can see 2 gas stations, because in addition to the gas station that was up next to the Grange, there was also a gas station that went in where the corner store, the wood frame corner store and stable used to be. This is a map from 1948, and you can still see that there's a little bit more development along Main Avenue and along some of the subdivisions that I've spoken about, but it was still largely rural and undeveloped. One thing that I point out on this map is that between Auburn Street and Summit Street was Summit View Park, which was a trotting park. And you can see here in the image some standard red horses racing, and this was the entrance off Washington Avenue into the park.
What was the name of that horse?
Summit View.
Summit View?
Summit.
Summit.
Yeah, sorry, my main accent coming up there.
Summit View.
Summit, like the street, Summit Street, yeah. As we move into the middle of the 20th century, we move from historic maps to aerial imagery. And this is one of the first aerial images I could find in 1953. So here's the corner, and we have here the Homestead subdivision, and you can see that the second street, which runs like right here, was really not developed at all. This is Pennell Avenue. This is Maplewood Park subdivision, and here over here is Main. And then there's Deering Village, which is it Brooks Road, I believe? Is that the right Brook Road? Brook Road. But you can still see there's lots of agricultural fields, no shopping centers yet. This is a Sanborn insurance map from just the following year. You can see the yellow at the top is where the Grange was located. Across the street from the Grange, where the pot shop is now, had already become 2 filling stations here in 1954. You can see in the diamond-shaped lot southwest of the intersection, this was that other filling station where we saw the bus parked in front of, or driving in front of, the church and the school. And there was a residential, a 2-family residence over here that also had a small corner store in it. In the 1960s, the Islands Quarter neighborhood was known as Gasoline Alley because there were so many filling stations. So you can see in the black and white image on the left, there's a Gulf, an Esso, and I think it's a Mobil station. It's kind of hard to read on the right-hand side, but 28 cents a gallon. Who would like to go back to those days? And then the 2 images images on the right are from the late 1960s, and they were taken at the American gas station, which replaced where the Gulf station is on the corner, which would be like right next to here where Dunkin' Donuts is. And then in 1956, we have Shaw's grocery store opening. And so Shaw's was built on part of that land that was initially, or for many years, owned by the Solomon Allen family and later owned by the Smith family. And here we are in 1964. We can see a lot more development in this aerial image. So here's Pennell Avenue, and we can see that the rest of that development has now been built out. All the houses exactly the same size, those little capes that are in that neighborhood. We can see that Brook Road, that initial subdivision was just kind of the U shape here, and that was expanded in, I think it was 63, it was right around this time that was laid out. Here's the Shaw's Plaza. But you can still see that this whole corner over here is still largely not developed, but soon will be. Here's a little bit closer image from an airplane. In 1965, you can see Shaw's Plaza in the upper left, a sea of parking lot. The new fire station has been built, and lots of gas stations and development. Some of the historic houses are starting to come down that were built in and around the intersection. And of course, one of the things that had a great impact on development, not just in Allen Corner, but throughout the greater Portland area, particularly on the outlying neighborhoods in Portland, was the arrival of the Main Turnpike. So Main Turnpike came through in two parts. Let me skip to my notes because I've not been keeping track here. So the first part was built completed in 1947, and then the second part, which connected from Portland north to Augusta, was completed in 1953. And certainly, the rise of the automobile had a great impact on the neighborhoods. And of all the neighborhoods that I've worked in and done similar talks like this, I think that neighborhoods like Woodford's, Deering Center, even East Deering, were largely built up before the rise of the car. And so they had the bones of a neighborhood that was walkable to the streetcar line, whereas your neighborhood remained rural for so long, it kind of really missed a lot of the building boom. And it's fairly similar to the Nason's Corner neighborhood off Brighton Avenue, and that was still largely rural. Started to see some early subdivision development in the 1920s, but of course the Great Depression put the kibosh on a lot of that development, and it really didn't boom again until the late 40s and early 50s after World War II. And so most of that development was very car-centric, as it is here. So the next slides, I'm going to put fairly quickly, because we've got to get from 1960s to the present here. Couldn't find an early picture. We really tried, didn't we, Brett, to find an early picture of Libs. But Libs came into being in 1969. A few years later, there was a North Deering restaurant, a Deering ice cream restaurant in North Deering. Deering Ice Cream was a local Portland company. Initially, they started making ice cream on St. John Street, and if you're familiar with the new Maine Medical Center parking garage, just in front of that is the Eagles Club. That was the original offices for the Deering ice cream manufacturing. They later moved to Walton Street, and then you can see that's the image in the bottom right is the Eagles Club building, and I think that's the 1924 image. I loved their coffee ice cream. When I was a kid, we'd go downtown to Porches and do shopping, which I hated, I still hate. And then we'd go across to Deering ice cream. If I'd been good, I could have Deering ice cream.
Christie's.
Young Christie's Hardware, 1960. Later, Mr. Bagel and Paris, 's Paris, 's, 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 Here's another aerial image from 1980, and now we can see the development of Northport Plaza. The occupants included Grants, which later became Ames. Big Buy Supermarket was then expanded in 1986 to the business park and was touted in the Portland Press Herald as the largest suburban multi-tenant office park in Greater Portland and perhaps Maine. I'm sorry, it was Evening Express, wrong. It was the night paper, not the day paper. And it was home to LL Beans Carlson, it was home to WGAN, Ventrix, Electrolux, and Hartford Life Insurance.
I remember there used to be a Grants there.
Yeah, Grants, and then it became Ames.
Yeah.
Unum was there as well for a short time.
Who was?
Unum.
Oh, I didn't know that. And so then we went from Gasoline Alley, there's still a fair amount of gas stations, to Bank Street, perhaps. There's an awful lot of banks in the neighborhood.
Okay.
And the next few slides will truly be then and now. There'll be some befores, durings, and afters. So this is 340 Allen Avenue. This was where the A&P store was. It later became Lockhart's, then Walgreens, and now Dollar General. And then next door, there was a fairly rough-looking historic house in 1924. I'm not surprised that came down. It's a little sway back. And then there was Burger King, and then Esco's very briefly, and Bangor Savings Bank. Across the street at 327 Allen Avenue is a dwelling that is still there, although expanded and slightly altered. That's the 1924 photo and then a more recent image. Next to that was originally a machine and a welding shop, and then it became Yerkes's, and then it was a dry cleaners, and now a nail salon. And then just slightly down the street from there, we have 295 Allen Avenue. There's a house, although the barn is gone and replaced with a two-car garage, the house is largely unchanged. And so too is 267 Allen Avenue. Again, it's lost its barn, but the house is pretty recognizable. Just that new front porch. And then we'll go back to the intersection. I think Dr. Allen, being in the temperance movement, I wonder how he'll feel. He might have something to say. And then across the street from Dr. Allen's house, this was the house that was a 2-unit house with a small corner store in it that I mentioned a little bit earlier. That's now where Amato's is now. And next door to that was this little house and barn, and it also had a pretty good-sized chicken coop out the back. That became Salatai and then Taco Bell.
Usually solid tide 30 years, and now it's a taco. Come downhill.
And then next to that was the North Deering Garage, which was a 1923 building, and that's on the site of where the Cumberland County Federal Credit Union is now. And then out in back was the Parker's Restaurant building. And, oh, there it is. It was slow in coming up. Didn't want to show you the Dunkin' Donuts, I guess. My computer was rebelling. So that's the stable that was connected to the store at the corner, now replaced by a Dunkin' Donuts. In the background of the stable image, you can see the side of the church. And that's all I've got.
Wow.
If somebody has questions, or if you don't like to raise your hand and ask questions, I'm kind of like that too. I can come down and you can catch me afterwards and talk to me if you want. But if somebody has a question they want to ask me in front of everybody, I'm happy to try and answer it. But first, before I do that, let me just say I want to thank Gretchen for all of her hard work. And another person who contributed to some of the research was Gabrielle Daniello, who works at the Portland Public Library. And I know that Abraham at the Public Library helped Gretchen a lot in some of the research for this, too. So thank you.
And if you don't mind, so staying up here for now, sorry, stay. And if we want to do a few questions, and if you would just repeat them, because we are doing a very low skills recording, but we are doing a recording. I just also wanted to recognize Abe Daly, who, sorry to put you on the spot, but who also provided some of the maps that led us to know that I live in Maplewood Park. Sounds very fancy. But yeah, we have Julie here if folks have a few questions. And then I was thinking maybe what we'll do is migrate downstairs, and then we can do stories if folks have them. I do have a couple that are kind of fun that somebody told me that I don't think the person's here. Yes, so I can add those. But let's just do like 5 minutes or so of questions up here.
I saw somebody over there, yes.
The Maplewood Cemetery, is it accessible to the public? And are there gravestones there from some of the people that you have?
So the question is Maplewood Cemetery accessible to the public? And I'm looking at Gretchen, who recently visited, and she's shaking her head yes. But we did say there wasn't a lot.
There was, when I went up to visit, it's hard to get to. You kind of have to walk up this hill in between some houses. The stone that I recognized was Cobb, and there was a hand Cobb that was a postmaster at the Prize Hall. But that's the only one. I didn't see Knight or Abbott. I think they're buried in somewhere else.
Yeah, so like Dr. Allen was buried at the Western Providence Cemetery, because that's where Mary Lovett's family was. And a lot of the other folks that I did research, their genealogy, are buried in Evergreen, some in Pine Grove, which is, I think that's what the name of it is. It's connected to Evergreen. It's the earlier cemetery.
And I would just add that I think somewhere online there is a listing of the graves in the Forbes Cemetery. So if I can find that, I will share it with folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of a mess.
George.
So I just want to see if you know the genealogy of the Allen family. So Tom Allen, the congressman, who was the grandson of Neil Allen, who married, I think, one of John Calvin Stevens' daughters. Those Allens weren't involved in the Allen's Corner name,
No,
right?
because Dr. Allen only had 4 daughters. So the name wouldn't have carried on
Because
from him.
someone had, I don't know, a couple of years ago, someone had sort of connected Neil Allen and Tom Allen's sort of family lineage to Allen's Corner, and
Yeah.
there's nothing to that, right?
So he was from Gray, and he had brothers. So that doesn't mean that they weren't descended from his brothers, but they're not directly from Dr. Allen.
No.
And so all of his daughters except one married. One daughter didn't marry, but she didn't have children either, and she died fairly young. So there weren't any other Allens. In fact, when he died, he and his wife died. A couple of his daughters were dead as well, and so it was his grandchildren that inherited part of the farm and lived there for a while. Yes?
What happened to Fall Brook? Was it filled?
Yeah, it's underground, essentially.
Underground.
Yeah.
How? By engineering?
Yeah, in the 60s.
Because that's where.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of great information if you're interested in learning more about Fall Brook, because the city has done a lot of work to try to bring the quality of Fall Brook back. I mean, obviously there's a lot of runoff that ends up into Fall Brook, which then dumps into the Brezunska, which goes into the clam flats in the harbor. So there's a lot online if you'd like to learn more about Fall Brook. You can just Google it, and the city reports will come up. Yes?
Regarding Fall Brook, you mentioned that why people settled in this particular area was that was a water supply. So my mind thought, okay, for humans or for their I don't know if they get what they had sheep. I mean, I have no idea.
Well, I'm not a water person.
Okay.
I know enough just to be dangerous. But I would surmise because there was so much surface water, there was probably a fairly high water table in that area, which would make for good wells.
Wells, yeah.
But certainly, Fall Brook ran through a lot of the fields. So I would imagine that if those fields were being used for agriculture, they probably used the water for agriculture. and, or they had, they were using it for their animals as
Yeah, I was
well.
curious to know if they had place wells, because I grew up behind St. Pius Church, which is on Ocean Avenue, it's not that far from here, and the brook, we always played down by the brook. I mean, it was Fall Brook, okay, I didn't ever question it, we just knew that was Fall Brook. That's a long way up to Allen Avenue, Allen Corner, if they were going to be using it. I'm thinking, how would they transport that for human use? Obviously.
Well, Fallbrook actually, there was a piece of it that started up by Lyseth.
Oh,
They came down underneath what is now what was Shaw's and is.
And it's still there, and some people helped pull 11 shopping carts out of it during our cleanup recently.
It's still there as a vestige up until Shaw's. You're looking at past Ray Street before it starts being something again.
Interesting, okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yes, sir.
Brigham Tins is a little bit dark about the neighborhood. When I was a little kid, I grew up on Hennessy, and I remember as a little kid going to Northgate, and Shaw's was on the other side. And I remember as if a cross had been burned on the side of the building. And when I went home and asked my mother about it, what I remembered it, because I was so young, she said something that an African American had been appointed to something, and so the KKK, and I don't know whether, I've often wondered about this incident, it affected me, and I've often wondered what this was, and does anybody know about this, because I've never been able to
Well, you're far too young to have been when the KKK had a huge stronghold in Portland in the 1920s. In fact, if you know where CBS is on Forest Avenue, that was actually their headquarters was there, right there by that code. But that was in the 1920s. That burned in like 22 to 24, somewhere in there. And as an organization that was out and quite busy in politics, they kind of descended away. But as you know, they never went away. They're still amongst us, right? So that's not surprising, but I've never heard that story before. So for those of you that couldn't hear, he was saying that there was a cross that you saw or had been burned at near Shaw's.
This would have been in the early 70s, when Shaw's was near the Boy Scout, where the Boy Scouts used to do this. So maybe I'm,
the best.
as a little 6-year-old, I was imagining.
No, sometimes there's something to it. The best thing to do would be the Portland Room at the public library has access to some of the Portland Press Herald and Evening Express. You could look up if you needed, like, was it summertime of 75 or whatever time you think it might have been. You could go through the newspaper articles. I mean, that's how I found the one that from when Portland was annexing Dearborn. Just a search. Yes, sir.
I do have a question about, there was a call from, historical photos. I remember this group made that. Did any of those did that make it in here, or did you rely mostly on library artifacts?
So Gretchen and Zoe had a great collection of photos, and some of them are on there. Also, there's some from the Portland Public Library, some from the Maine Historical Society. A couple, I think, are landmarks photos. And then the thing that Facebook is not one of my favorite places, but it does have some good points. And one of its good points is a group called Portland, Maine to the present, 1786 to the present, I think is what the name of the group is. And it's a treasure trove of images, so like bus images and train images. I mean, we didn't even talk about the train because the train didn't come right through Allen's Corner, but it's got a lot of great images on it, and that's mostly, I would say, crowdsourced. It's the best way to say it. But it's a great place that people will scan their family's images. Oftentimes you'll see someone's cleaning out their mom or dad's house or their grandparents' house, and they'll post some really cool photos on there. So that's where some of those came from, too.
And we didn't get any photos through that call, did we? Or did you end up getting some?
There were some, but they were duplicates of others that we had already.
Yeah, I think we did. We got a lot of what you see in here through the main memory network.
Yeah, that's where the 1924 tax photos are.
Right,
So-
right. But it's not too late. I mean, I think it would be, I was picturing us having like a photo album, like a Flickr album or something of the photos. There were a lot more that we found that we could share. And then if folks have some, that they wanted to,
I think people and photos of insides of buildings are
Yeah.
always really interesting too. You'll notice I didn't have one of the church. I realized as I was walking in today, I'm like, oh, I never found one of the church to put in the slideshow. And we had a hard time finding the school photo. It was the only one that Gretchen found. It was the one with the boat in the front of it. Oh, I should point out that boat that was in front of it was built in a boatyard across the street. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, I'm sorry, there was so much I could have talked about and added, but
We can do it.
I didn't want to bore you all there. Yes, Nancy.
Julie, I wondered, it seems to me the very first railroad would have come through or very close to Allen's Corner, right? As early as the 1840s?
It crossed closer to Marl's Corner than it did Allen's Corner. And then it just kind of skirted the neighborhood, so it didn't have much of a development impact.
Do you have any idea how many trains a day would have gone down the tracks?
No.
I've had a lot of trouble investigating that.
Yeah, you need to go to the train museum and find someone who loves trains, because there are a lot of people out there that love trains and probably.
Yeah, I was going to say there are a lot of people who love trains.
Yeah. And I kind of glaze over when it gets to trains. Yes, in the back?
One building that wasn't mentioned was Cannabis Drugstore.
Yeah.
And I lived on Summer Street and walked down to Allen's Corner to ice skate all day Saturday. And I couldn't have survived if I could have got my hot chocolate at Cannabis Drugstore and then walked all the way back.
That skate was behind our house where we grew up. And they had a doggy
I think, the A&P became
So what was the name of the drugstore?
Cannabis.
Canavan.
And which building was it in? Which corner?
It was where the A&P, that corner store.
Okay.
There was a barber shop there too that lasted into the 90s.
Okay.
You can
Ice skate out back here where,
Oh, I was vocational.
oh, okay.
Is it on the pond that's behind the development? What is it?
There's condos there now, yeah, there's condos.
That is okay.
And then used to be used to stay, we walk on that back down there, it was
Oh, okay.
Behind the barber.
Fire department.
Other people had said they ice skated, and I couldn't figure out where they were ice skating, so that's good to know.
my neighbors, I went up, looked across the street when I first came here, they said, and I was
Yes, ma'am.
I think that they would have a fire department, one man that lives in that big house, I think it was part of.
Oh, he would supplement it with a little extra water, make it nice and smooth for the kids. That's good. Okay. George, you know you can talk to me anytime, George.
Well, no, it's just, you obviously had a lot of ground cover, but like the environmental history of the neighborhood, I think has a lot to, it's not a coincidence that things really took off sort of post-1980 when the Ocean Avenue landfill, they stopped the burn and dump over there, and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act had started to make maybe the paper mills a little bit more honest with what they were doing with the river and what was coming out of the chimneys. And so that, I think, the harbor was getting cleaned up. It made it much more acceptable to be out in this corner of Portland, I think.
It became more idyllic, yes.
I don't know if that people remember because, obviously when everything was polluted, nobody really noticed exactly where the pollution was. But I've heard stories about like they had to close down 295 every so often in the early years because the smoke from the Ocean Avenue landfill from burning had gotten so bad it had drifted over and basically caused like a fog bank. And so they had to shut down 295 every so often until the smoke dies down. So.
Well, I remember when I first started my company, this was in the 90s, my partner lived up on the Western Prom, and it was on a third floor apartment, and the smell from SD Warren would waft in every now and again. You'd be sitting there talking, watching TV, and all of a sudden you'd be like, oh my God, I gotta go. I'm going home where the air is clean. And my dad grew up in Westbrook. I took him to Madawaska one day, and it was a very overcast day, and the mill was just pumping that smell into the air. And my dad's eyes were watering. And I'm like, you grew up in Westbrook, Dad. What is the problem with you? He said, it was never like this. And like, your eyes are just too rosy. Yes?
So we just have, what was the name of the bowling alley?
Oh,
Okay, all along.
yes.
It's called
Somebody here will tell you.
Northgate Bowl-A-Rama.
Yes. I did see a picture of that. There is a picture of that somewhere.
So, sorry, how about 2 more questions, and then what we'll do is we'll release Julie from being in the hot seat, and then we have some baked goods downstairs, but we can keep the conversation going. But if you want to go ahead.
As you know, because you and I met in the parking lot, I thought this started at 6, and she told me it started at 6:30. So I ran across over to Dollar Tree to pick up a few things, and I told a few people there about this, because I thought they might be interested. There was a gal who had grown up here. She was at the checkout, and she said there used to be a butcher. She remembered a butcher.
Yeah, Countryside Butcher was here.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay, and I didn't remember
For
that.
30 years.
Really like 1930s or... You know the area and the era
Of the butcher shop?
of the butcher
50s,
shop?
60s.
Pre-World War II, post-Korea? No idea?
No.
No? Okay.
Countryside.
I don't remember a butcher shop. Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Well, thank you so much for all your work.